The security guard at the First National Bank on Westchester Avenue had seen a lot of things in 12 years on the night shift. He had pulled a man out of a running car in the parking lot at 3 a.m., the engine still on, the garage door closed. He had found a woman sleeping in the drive-through lane, wrapped in a bank deposit bag. He had never, in all that time, seen a 75-year-old woman walk through the front doors at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, carrying a man's wool coat over her arm like it was a baby, and ask to speak to the manager about a life insurance policy worth $3 million. Ida Kostas stood at the counter with the coat draped across both forearms. The guard told her the bank was closed. She did not move. She said she knew the bank was closed. She said she had walked 43 minutes from the church basement on Fuller Street because she needed to be somewhere with good light and a flat surface and a manager who could witness something. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was not. The guard asked if she had called ahead. She said she did not own a phone. He asked if she had someone who could come get her. She said her husband was dead. Manager's name was Dennis Okonkwo. He was 34 years old and he had been asleep on his couch when his phone rang at 11:52 p.m. He came to the bank in sweatpants and a winter coat thrown over a t-shirt. He unlocked the door himself. He sat her down in his office under the fluorescent lights and he watched her lay the coat across his desk. She did not speak for a long moment. She just looked at the coat. Then she reached into the pocket of her own worn cardigan and pulled out a pair of tailor's shears, black steel, the blades still sharp after 61 years, and a small brass tool, a thread counter, the kind textile workers used to check the density of weave. She placed them on the desk next to the coat. She said, "My husband sewed this coat himself. He put something inside the lining. I need you to watch me cut it open." Dennis Okonkwo did not know what he was witnessing. He did not know that the coat had been hanging in a closet in a 2-bedroom apartment for 3 years, untouched, because Ida could not bring herself to touch it. He did not know that the man who had sewn that coat had been a tailor for 54 years, that he had measured every seam by hand, that he had taught himself to cut fabric at the age of 12 in a village outside Thessaloniki, that he had come to America with nothing but a pair of shears and the address of a cousin who did not want him. He did not know that the woman sitting in his chair had worked in a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, for 37 years, that she had checked the thread count on 10,000 bolts of fabric, that her fingers knew the difference between a 50-thread weave and a 200-thread weave by touch alone. He did not know any of this, but he watched her lift the shears, and he did not stop her. Ida made the first cut along the inside seam of the left sleeve. The thread parted cleanly. She had been unpicking the lining to repair a small tear at the cuff, a tear that had been there for months, a tear she had not had the strength to address until tonight. She had brought the coat into the church basement because the light was better there, because the heating grate on the floor was warm, because she had nowhere else to go. She had threaded a needle. She had turned the sleeve inside out. And her fingers, the fingers that had checked thread count for 37 years, had felt something stiff inside the lining, not padding, not interfacing, paper. She worked the shears along the seam with a precision that Dennis Okonkwo recognized from his own father, a man who had been a carpenter in Enugu and had never once used a power tool. She did not rush. She did not tear. She opened the lining like a wound, and she reached inside with 2 fingers, and she pulled out a document folded 3 times, yellowed at the edges, the creases deep as scars. She unfolded it on the desk. She read it once to herself. She read it a second time out loud, because she needed to hear the words in the air, because she needed to believe they were real. It was an assignment of benefits. A life insurance policy issued by Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, policy number 447A3-9912, with a death benefit of $3 million. The policy had been assigned exclusively to Rupert Kostas, the insured, by his own signature. The assignment was dated August 12, 2019. It had been witnessed by 2 people, George Mavrakis, a retired florist, and Elena Papadopoulos, a retired schoolteacher, both of them still alive, both of them still living in the same neighborhood. Both of them able to testify that Rupert Kostas, at the age of 76, had signed this document with his own hand. The coat fell open on the desk. Ida set the shears down next to the thread counter. She looked at Dennis Okonkwo and she said, "My son put us out our house. He said we signed everything over to him. He said we had no claim. My husband died 3 weeks after we left. He died in a rented room with a space heater and a hot plate. He died thinking we had nothing." He was wrong. This is the story of how Ida Kostas came to be standing in a bank lobby at midnight with a pair of shears and a dead man's coat. But to understand that, you have to go back. You have to go back to the shears. They were made in 1963 by a small tool company in Solingen, Germany, a city that had been forging steel since the Middle Ages. The company was called Dovo, and they made razors and scissors and shears that barbers and tailors passed down to their sons. Rupert Kostas bought his first pair of Dovo shears in 1963, the year he opened his own shop on a side street in Astoria, Queens. He was 23 years old. He had been in America for 4 years. He had saved every dollar he earned working in a dry cleaning plant, pressing suits for men who would never know his name. He bought the shears with cash, $240, which was more than the rent on his apartment. He kept them in a leather case. He sharpened them himself once a month using a whetstone he had brought from Greece. He never let anyone else touch them. The shop was small, 16 feet wide, 40 feet deep, a front window that faced the street, a wooden floor that groaned in winter. A single bathroom in the back with a sink that always dripped. Rupert worked behind a cutting table that he had built himself from a solid oak door. He stood at that table for 54 years, measuring, cutting, pinning, stitching. He made suits for grooms and widowers and men who had just gotten their first real job. He made dresses for brides who could not afford a formal gown. He altered hems for women whose husbands had died and who needed to wear black for a year. He never turned anyone away. He never raised his voice. He kept a jar of hard candies on the counter for children who came with their parents, and he gave each child a piece, and he asked them their names, and he remembered them. He met Ida in 1965. She was working at the textile mill in Lowell, 3 hours north, but she had come to Astoria to visit her cousin. She walked past his shop on a Saturday afternoon in October. The light was falling through the front window, and Rupert was standing at his cutting table, a length of charcoal wool spread across the oak, the shears in his hand, his body bent over the fabric like a man in prayer. She stopped. She watched him cut. She watched him lay the shears down and run his hand across the edge of the cloth. She watched him look up and see her standing in the window, and she watched him smile. He married her 8 months later. She moved to Astoria. She found work at a smaller textile house in Brooklyn, checking thread count on imported fabric, using the same brass counter that her mother had used before her. She kept the thread counter in her apron pocket. She would pull it out at dinner and show Rupert how many threads per inch a particular bolt had, and he would nod, and he would say, "Good weave, good weave." He meant the fabric. He meant her. He meant their life. They had one child, a son. They named him Alexander. They poured everything into him. Rupert worked double shifts. Ida took on extra hours. They paid for private school, then college, then law school. Alexander Kostas became a real estate attorney. He married a woman named Courtney, whose father owned a chain of auto body shops. They had a house in Westchester County with a 2-car garage and a lawn that a man came to mow every Thursday. Alexander drove a black BMW with tinted windows. Courtney drove a Lexus SUV. They had 2 children, a girl and a boy, and they sent them to a school that cost $30,000 a year. And when Alexander came to visit his parents in Astoria, he parked his BMW on the street, walked past the shop window where his father still stood at the cutting table, and said, "Dad, when are you going to retire? This place is a liability." Rupert kept cutting. He did not look up. He said, "This place is paid for." Alexander said, "The neighborhood is changing. The rent could be triple what it is. You're sitting on an asset." Rupert said, "I am sitting on a cutting table." This conversation happened every visit. It happened at Christmas dinner, at Easter, at the birthday parties for the grandchildren that Rupert and Ida drove an hour and a half to attend in Westchester. It happened in the kitchen of the apartment above the shop, the apartment where Rupert and Ida had lived for 52 years, where the wallpaper had been put up in 1974 and had never been replaced, where the stove had 3 working burners and the refrigerator door had a dent from the day Rupert had tripped with a bag of groceries in 1987. Alexander would sit at the small kitchen table, his suit jacket draped over the back of the chair, and he would tell his parents that they needed to think about the future. He would tell them that the property was worth $2.3 million, that they could sell it and move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier, somewhere where they wouldn't have to climb stairs. He would tell them that he could manage the sale for them, that he had the connections, that he could get them the best price. Rupert would listen. He would nod. And then he would say, "The shop is not for sale." Alexander would lean back in his chair. He would look at his mother. He would say, "Mom, talk to him." Ida would look at her hands. She would say, "Your father made that table with his own hands." Alexander would stand up. He would take his jacket. He would say, "I'm trying to help you. You don't see it now, but you will." The visits became less frequent. The phone calls became shorter. The grandchildren grew older, and the birthday parties became sleepovers at friends' houses, and then there were more birthday parties in Westchester because the children were teenagers now and they had their own plans. Rupert and Ida still made the trip. They still brought gifts, but they sat in the kitchen of their own apartment on a Sunday evening, and the phone did not ring, and the shop was quiet, and Rupert would sharpen his shears and say nothing. The Tuesday in November came in 2019. It was the third Tuesday of the month. The sky was low and gray. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees by noon, and the wind came off the East River in gusts that rattled the shop window. Rupert was working on a suit for a man named George Mavrakis, the florist, who had lost 50 pounds and needed everything taken in. Rupert had known George for 40 years. George had brought flowers to Rupert and Ida's wedding. George had brought flowers to the shop every year on the anniversary of the wedding, even after Ida had told him to stop, even after the shop had become so small that there was nowhere to put the vase. George had brought flowers to the hospital when Rupert had his gallbladder removed in 2004. George was the kind of friend who did not need to be asked. Rupert was measuring the sleeve of the jacket when Alexander walked in. He was wearing a black cashmere coat. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He did not take off his coat. He stood in the middle of the shop, the door still open behind him, the cold air coming in, and he said, "I need you to sign something." Rupert put down his measuring tape. He looked at his son. He said, "Close the door." Alexander closed the door. He set the portfolio on the cutting table. He opened it. He pulled out a stack of documents, maybe 40 pages, and he placed them on the oak surface where Rupert had cut fabric for half a century. He said, "It's a power of attorney and a property transfer. It's standard. It just means that if something happens to you, I can manage things without going through probate. It saves time. It saves money." Rupert looked at the documents. He did not touch them. He said, "I have a will." Alexander said, "A will goes through probate. This bypasses it. It's cleaner. It's what everyone does." He pulled a pen from his coat pocket. He set it on the papers. He said, "You just need to sign, Dad. Please." Rupert looked at his son. He looked at the cashmere coat, the leather portfolio, the pen that cost more than the suit he was making for George Mavrakis. He looked at the documents. He did not read them. He said, "Where is your mother?" Alexander said, "She's upstairs. I already talked to her." Rupert said, "You talked to her." Alexander said, "She understands." She signed. Rupert picked up the pen. He held it. He looked at the shears on the table, the Dovo shears that he had bought in 1963, the shears that had cut fabric for thousands of suits, the shears that had never cut a piece of paper. He put the pen down. He said, "I need to read this first." Alexander said, "There's no time." "I have a meeting at 2. Rupert said, "Then you will be late for your meeting." He picked up the documents. He carried them to the small desk in the back of the shop, where he kept his ledger and his receipts and a photograph of Ida on their wedding day. He sat down. He put on his reading glasses. He read every page. It took him 43 minutes. Alexander stood at the cutting table, checking his watch, tapping his fingers on the oak. He did not sit down. He did not take off his coat. When Rupert finished, he set the documents down. He looked at his son. He said, "This transfers everything. The shop, the building, the apartment, all of it. To you, with no conditions." Alexander said, "It's for tax purposes. It's more efficient. You can still live here. Nothing changes." Rupert said, "Nothing changes." Alexander said, "Dad, I'm a lawyer. I know what I'm doing." Rupert sat for a long time. The shop was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, the same clock that had been there since 1963, the clock that Rupert had wound every Sunday night for 56 years. He looked at the photograph of Ida. He looked at the shears on the cutting table. He looked at his son, who had not once looked at the photographs on the wall, who had not once touched the fabric samples on the shelf, who had not once asked his father about the suit he was making. Rupert picked up the pen. He signed. He signed his name on every page, 43 pages, because Alexander said the copies needed to be notarized separately. He signed without reading again. He signed because his son was a lawyer and a father and a man he had raised and loved and believed in. He signed because he was 76 years old and he was tired and he wanted his son to stop standing in his shop in a cashmere coat, tapping his fingers on the cutting table. Alexander gathered the documents. He put them in the portfolio. He closed it. He said, "Thank you, Dad. You made the right decision." He left. The door closed behind him. The cold air settled. Rupert sat at his desk for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked to the cutting table. He picked up his shears. He finished measuring the sleeve for George Mavrakis' suit. Ida had signed too. Alexander had gone upstairs first, before his father, while Rupert was in the shop with a customer. He had knocked on the door of the apartment. He had sat at the kitchen table. The the one with the dent from the bag of groceries. He had spread the same documents across the same surface where Rupert and Ida had eaten dinner every night for 52 years. He had told her it was for estate planning, that it would save them taxes, that it was what every smart family did. He had used the word smart 3 times. Ida had signed because she trusted her son, because she loved him, because she did not believe that a child could hold a pen that would erase his parents' life. Rupert did not tell Ida about the 50-pound suit he was making. Ida did not tell Rupert about the conversation at the kitchen table. They did not talk about the signing. They did not talk about Alexander's visit. They ate dinner that night, as they always did, at 6 o'clock. They had lentil soup and bread. Rupert sharpened his shears after dinner. Ida counted the threads on a piece of fabric she had brought home from the textile house. They watched the news. They went to bed. The first change came in January. The property tax bill arrived. Rupert opened it. The name on the bill was Alexander Kostas. Rupert called his son. Alexander said it was just a clerical thing, that the transfer had to be recorded, that it didn't mean anything. Rupert said, "But the tax bill is in your name." Alexander said, "It's fine, Dad. Don't worry about it." The second change came in March, a letter from a property management company. Rupert opened it. It said that the company had been retained by the owner of the building, Alexander Kostas, to manage the property. It said that all rent payments for the apartment should be directed to the management company. It said that the commercial lease for the tailor shop would be renewed at market rate. Rupert called his son. This time, Alexander did not answer. Rupert called again. He called 3 times. On the third call, Alexander's wife, Courtney, answered. She said Alexander was in a meeting. She said she would have him call back. He did not call back. Rupert sat at the cutting table. He looked at the letter. He looked at the shears. He looked at the photograph of Ida on their wedding day. He did not say anything. He folded the letter. He put it in the drawer with the receipts. He picked up his measuring tape. He measured a piece of charcoal wool for a suit that no one had ordered. The third change came in May, a notice of eviction. It was taped to the door of the apartment. It said that the tenant, Rupert Kostas, was required to vacate the premises within 30 days. It cited a breach of lease terms. It said the property was being redeveloped. Ida found it first. She was coming back from the market. She had a bag of oranges and a loaf of bread. She saw the paper taped to the door. She read it. She did not drop the bag. She set the oranges and the bread on the floor. She walked downstairs to the shop. She stood in front of the cutting table. She said, "Rupert, there is a paper on the door." Rupert looked at her. He saw her face. He knew. He set down his shears. He walked upstairs. He read the notice. He stood in the hallway for a long time. Then he went back downstairs. He picked up the phone. He called his son. This time Alexander answered. Rupert said, "There is an eviction notice on my door." Alexander said, "It's a formality. The building is being sold. The new owners need the space empty." "I can't do anything about it." Rupert said, "You are the new owners." Alexander said, "I'm the owner. The building is being redeveloped. It's a business decision." Rupert said, "Where am I supposed to go?" Alexander said, "You can find a place. I'll help you with the first month's rent. But you need to understand, Dad, this is how it works. You can't hold on something forever." Rupert said nothing. Alexander said, "Dad, are you there?" Rupert hung up. He stood in the shop. The light was falling through the front window. The dust was floating in the air. The shears were on the cutting table. The measuring tape was draped over a bolt of navy wool. The clock was ticking. He looked at the walls, covered with photographs of customers in their suits, of weddings he had tailored for, of children he had measured for their first communion. He looked at the floor, worn smooth by 56 years of footsteps. He looked at his hands. He did not call his son again. The move took 3 days. Rupert and Ida packed everything they owned into cardboard boxes that they got from the liquor store on the corner. They did not have much. Clothes, dishes, a few photographs, the shears, the thread counter. The oak cutting table could not fit through the door, so they left it. The clock could not come because it was bolted to the wall. The jar of hard candy stayed on the counter. Rupert took the shears. Ida took the thread counter. They took 2 bags each. The apartment they moved into was a 1-bedroom in a building on the other side of Astoria, closer to the highway, where the rent was $800 a month. It had a space heater and a hot plate. The bathroom light flickered. The windows did not seal properly, and the cold came in through the gaps. They put a towel at the bottom of the door. They slept in their coats. Rupert did not open a new shop. He did not have the money. He did not have the space. He sat in the small room with the space heater and the hot plate, and he held his shears in his lap, and he looked out the window at the highway. Ida went to the church basement on Fuller Street because it was warm and because they served coffee and because she could not stand to sit in the room and watch her husband disappear. The church basement had a linoleum floor that was cold even in summer. It had metal folding chairs and a table with a coffee urn and a box of donated clothes in the corner. It had a heating grate in the center of the floor that blew warm air when the furnace was running, and the people who came sat around it in a circle, their chairs angled toward the heat, their hands wrapped around styrofoam cups. Ida went every day. She sat on the same chair, the one closest to the grate. She drank coffee, she talked to no one. She brought the coat. The coat was Rupert's best. He had made it himself in 2017 from a bolt of English wool that a customer had ordered and then never picked up. It was a heavy overcoat, double-breasted, with a velvet collar and a silk lining. He had sewn every seam by hand. He had finished the buttonholes with a stitch that took him 4 hours. He had worn it only once to his grandson's bar mitzvah, and then he had hung it in the closet because he did not want to wear it out. It was the last thing he made. He took it to the apartment. He hung it on a hook on the back of the door. He never wore it. He looked at it sometimes from the chair by the space heater, and Ida would see him looking, and she would say nothing. The winter came. The apartment got colder. The space heater ran all day and all night, and the electric bill came, and they could not pay it, and the heat was shut off in February. Rupert got sick. It started as a cough. It became pneumonia. Ida took him to the emergency room at Elmhurst Hospital. They kept him for 3 days. They gave him antibiotics. They sent him home. The apartment was 38 degrees when they walked in. Rupert sat in the chair by the window. He held the shears. He looked at the highway. He said, "I should have read the papers." Ida said, "You trusted him." Rupert said, "I should have read them." Ida said, "We both signed. We both trusted him." Rupert said nothing. He looked at the shears. He ran his thumb along the blade. He died on the morning of 14/2020. Ida was in the kitchen, heating soup on the hot plate. She heard him exhale. She turned. He was still holding the shears. His hand had opened. The shears had fallen to the floor. She picked them up. She set them on the table. She sat next to him. She held his hand. She stayed there until the afternoon when the neighbor from downstairs knocked on the door to check on them and found them both sitting in the cold, one alive and one not. The funeral was small. George Mavrakis came. He brought flowers. Elena Papadopoulos came. She brought a loaf of bread. Alexander did not come. He sent a text message. It said, "I can't make it. Court tomorrow. My condolences." Ida read the message. She put the phone down. She did not reply. The coat hung on the back of the door for 3 years. Ida could not touch it. She could not give it away. She could not throw it out. She left it there, an outline in the dark, a shape that had been Rupert's. She slept in the bed alone. She ate at the hot plate alone. She went to the church basement alone. The thread counter stayed in her pocket. The shears stayed on the table. The Tuesday in November, when everything changed, was the 3rd Tuesday of the month. Ida woke up at 6 in the morning, as she always did. She made coffee on the hot plate. She sat in the chair by the window. The sky was gray. The highway was loud. She looked at the coat on the back of the door. She saw a small tear in the lining at the cuff of the left sleeve. She had noticed it before. She had meant to fix it. She had not had the strength. That morning, something was different. She did not know what. She finished her coffee. She stood up. She took the coat off the hook. She folded it over her arm. She put on her shoes. She walked to the church basement. The heating grate was warm. She sat in her usual chair. She took the needle and thread from her pocket. She turned the sleeve inside out, and her fingers found the paper. She unpicked the lining with the same precision she had used for 37 years in the textile mill, the same care she had used to check the thread count on 10,000 bolts of fabric. She did not tear. She did not rush. She opened the seam along the cuff, and she reached inside, and she pulled out the folded document. She set the coat down. She opened the paper. She read it. $3 million, assigned to Rupert Kostas, signed by his own hand, witnessed by George Mavrakis and Elena Papadopoulos. Dated August 12, 2019, 3 months before the signing in the shop, 3 months before Alexander had come with the portfolio and the pen and the cashmere coat. Rupert had known. He had known something was coming. He had not told her. He had not told anyone. He had sewn the policy into the lining of his best coat, the coat he had made with his own hands, the coat that hung on the back of the door for 3 years, the coat she had been afraid to touch. He had left it for her. He had trusted her to find it. Ida sat in the church basement with the document in her hands. The heating grate hummed, the coffee urn gurgled. The other people in the circle were talking, but she could not hear them. She looked at the signature. She looked at the date. She looked at the names of the witnesses. She folded the paper. She put it in her pocket. She picked up the coat. She walked out of the church basement at 10:47 p.m. She walked 43 minutes to the First National Bank on Westchester Avenue. She walked because she needed to be somewhere with good light and a flat surface and a manager who could witness something. She walked because she could not wait until morning. She walked because her husband had sewn a secret into the lining of his coat, and she had found it, and she was not going to let it stay hidden anymore. Dennis Okonkwo read the document 3 times. He looked at Ida. He said, "Do you know what this means?" Ida said, "I know what it means." Dennis said, "This policy is valid. The assignment is clear. The witnesses are alive. You need to call the insurance company tomorrow. You need to call the witnesses. You need to get a lawyer." Ida said, "I don't have money for a lawyer." Dennis said, "You have $3 million. You can get a lawyer." Ida looked at the coat. She looked at the shears. She looked at the thread counter. She picked up the document. She folded it. She put it back in her pocket. She said, "I need to call George Mavrakis." Dennis handed her his phone. She dialed the number from memory. It rang 4 times. A voice answered, old and tired. "George," Ida said. "It's Ida Kostas. I need to ask you something. Do you remember a document my husband signed in August of 2019? A life insurance policy. You witnessed it." There was a pause. Then George Mavrakis said, "I remember. He came to my shop. He had the paper. He asked me to sign. I asked him what it was. He said it was for his wife. He said, if anything happens to me, she will find it. I signed it." Elena signed it too. Ida closed her eyes. George said, "Ida, where are you?" Ida said, "I am at a bank with a manager. I have the coat." George said, "The coat." Ida said, "He sewed it into the lining." George said nothing for a long moment. Then he said he was a good man. Ida said, "I know." She hung up. She handed the phone back to Dennis. She stood up. She folded the coat over her arm. She put the shears and the thread counter in her pocket. She looked at Dennis Okonkwo and she said, "Thank you for opening the door." Dennis said, "What are you going to do now?" Ida walked to the door of the bank. She stopped. She turned. She said, "I am going to call a lawyer, and then I am going to find my son." She stepped out into the cold. The door closed behind her. The street was empty. The wind came off the river. She clutched the coat to her chest. She started walking. The document was in her pocket, against her heart. The shears were in her other hand. The thread counter was on the desk in the bank, where she had left it by accident, a small brass tool that had been her mother's, that had been hers, that had measured thread count for 3 generations. She did not realize she had left it until she was 2 blocks away. She stopped. She looked back at the bank. She did not go back for it. She kept walking. The coat was warm against her chest. The document was heavy in her pocket. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. The city was quiet. She walked north, toward the highway, toward the apartment with the space heater and the hot plate and the empty chair by the window. She walked because she had nowhere else to go. She walked because she had $3 million in her pocket and no one to spend it on. She walked because the man who had sewed that coat had trusted her to find what he had hidden, and she had found it, and now she had to decide what to do with it. The coat smelled like him, like wool and thread and the faint trace of the cologne he had worn on their wedding day. She pressed her face into the collar. She kept walking. The document crinkled against her ribs. The shears were cold in her hand. The night was dark and long, and the city was full of lights, and she was 75 years old, and her husband was dead, and she had just discovered that he had left her a fortune, and she did not know if she wanted it, or if she wanted to burn it, or if she wanted to walk into the river and let it sink. But she kept walking, because Rupert had not sewn that document into the lining of his coat for her to give up. He had sewn it there for her to find, and she had found it. And she was not going to stop now. She kept walking. Document crinkled against her ribs. The shears were cold in her hand. The night was dark and long, and the city was full of lights, and she was 75 years old, and her husband was dead, and she had just discovered that he had left her a fortune, and she did not know if she wanted it, or if she wanted to burn it, or if she wanted to walk into the river and let it sink. But she kept walking, because Rupert had not sewn that document into the lining of his coat for her to give up. He had sewn it there for her to find, and she had found it, and she was not going to stop now. The wind picked up as she crossed the bridge. The river below was black and moving fast. She stopped at the midpoint and looked down. The water had no memory. It carried everything away: paper, bone, the names of the dead. She could drop the document over the railing and watch it dissolve. She could walk home and pretend she had found nothing. She could let the insurance company bury the file in their archives and never know. But Rupert had known. He had known when he sewed that paper into the lining. He had known when he sat in George Mavrakis' shop and asked him to witness his signature. He had known that she would find it or that she would not, and he had trusted her either way. She tucked the coat tighter under her arm and kept walking. The apartment was dark when she reached it. The space heater clicked on as she opened the door. She hung the coat on the back of the chair by the window. She set the document on the kitchen table. She placed the shears next to it. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the three objects: the coat, the paper, the shears. Then she filled the kettle and lit the burner. While the water boiled, she took out her phone. She had no lawyer. She had no son. She had no one to call. But she had a number. The number Dennis Okonkwo had given her before she left the bank, a man named Marcus Chen, a lawyer who handled complex estates. Dennis had said, "If anyone can help you, it's him." She dialed. The phone rang 3 times. A woman's voice answered. "Chen and Associates. Ida Quinn," Ida said. "I have a document I need reviewed. A life insurance policy. $3 million. I need to know if it's valid and how to claim it." There was a pause. Then the woman said, "1 moment, please." The kettle boiled. Ida poured the water over a tea bag. She waited. Marcus Chen came on the line. His voice was calm, professional, unhurried. "Mrs. Quinn, Dennis Okonkwo told me you might call. He said you found something in a coat." "I did," Ida said. "Can you describe the document?" Ida described it. The date, the signatures, the witness, the amount. She did not mention the coat or the shears or the thread counter she had left behind on the bank desk. She did not mention the 3 generations of measuring that had led her to that moment. Marcus Chen said, "I'll need to see the original." "Can you bring it to my office tomorrow morning?" "Yes," Ida said. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock. She hung up. She sat down at the kitchen table. She drank her tea. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the space heater and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. She looked at the coat. She looked at the document. She looked at the shears. She did not sleep. At dawn, she showered. She put on the only clean dress she owned. She folded the document into her handbag. She put the shears in her pocket. She left the coat hanging on the chair. She walked to the bus stop and waited. The bus came. She got on. She sat by the window. The city passed by in gray light. The document was heavy in her bag. The shears were cold against her thigh. She did not know what she was walking toward. She only knew that she was walking. Marcus Chen's office was in a building downtown on the 12th floor. The receptionist offered her coffee. Ida declined. She sat in a chair and waited. The clock on the wall ticked. The document in her bag felt like a second heart. Marcus Chen came out to meet her. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 40, with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm, steady gaze. He shook her hand and led her into his office. "Show me what you found," he said. Ida opened her bag. She took out the document. She laid it on his desk. She smoothed the creases with her palm. Marcus Chen put on a pair of reading glasses. He examined the document in silence. He turned it over. He looked at the signatures. He looked at the notary stamp. He looked at the date. He took off his glasses. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, "this is a valid policy. It was issued by Northern Trust Life on August 12, 2019. The beneficiary is listed as Ida Quinn. The payout is $3 million plus accrued interest." Ida said nothing. "There's only one problem," Marcus Chen said. Ida waited. "The policy was reported as lapsed in September of 2020. The premiums were not paid." Ida's hands were still on the desk. She looked at them. They were old hands. The knuckles were swollen. The skin was thin. She had measured thread with those hands. She had held Rupert's hand as he died. "I didn't know about the policy," she said. "I didn't know there were premiums to pay." "I understand," Marcus Chen said. "But the insurance company will argue that the policy was voided due to non-payment. We'll need to prove that you were not informed of the policy's existence and therefore could not have known to pay the premiums. We'll need to prove that the policy was intentionally concealed from you." "Concealed by whom?" Marcus Chen leaned back in his chair. "Do you know who was listed as the policy's owner?" Ida shook her head. "Your daughter-in-law," Marcus Chen said. "Elena Vasquez." Ida's breath caught. She closed her eyes. She saw Elena's face. She saw the half-smile, the cold eyes. She saw the way Elena had looked at her at Rupert's funeral, as if she were already dead. "She was the owner of the policy," Marcus Chen continued. "She was responsible for paying the premiums. She let it lapse. And she did not inform you of its existence." Ida opened her eyes. "Why would she do that?" "Because she knew it belonged to you," Marcus Chen said. "Your husband named you as beneficiary, but he named her as owner. Perhaps he trusted her to manage it. Perhaps he did not realize what she would do. But she let it lapse. She let it die. And then she told no one." Ida sat very still. The shears were in her pocket. The document was on the desk. The coat was at home, hanging on the back of a chair by a window. "Can we prove it?" she asked. "We can try," Marcus Chen said, "but we'll need witnesses." We'll need the notary. We'll need Elena's financial records. We'll need to show a pattern of intent. Ida thought of George Mavrakis. She thought of the shop on the corner. She thought of the signature he had witnessed, the signature Elena had also witnessed, the signature that had been sewn into a coat and hidden for 4 years. I have a witness, Ida said. George Mavrakis. He owns a dry cleaning shop. He signed the policy. He remembers. Marcus Chen wrote it down. Anyone else? Ida thought of Dennis Okonkwo. She thought of the safe deposit box. She thought of the key she had worn around her neck for months without knowing what it opened. I have a bank manager, she said. Dennis Okonkwo. He opened the box. He saw the policy. Marcus Chen wrote that down too. It's a start, he said, but it won't be easy. The insurance company will fight. They don't want to pay $3 million on a lapse policy. And Elena Vasquez will fight. She has lawyers. She has money. Ida said, I have a coat. Marcus Chen looked at her. A coat, he said. Rupert sewed the policy into the lining, Ida said. He hid it. He wanted me to find it. And I did. That coat is evidence. It proves he intended for me to have it. Marcus Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, that's not nothing. Ida stood up. She picked up the document. She folded it carefully and put it back in her bag. I'll be in touch, she said. She walked out of the office. She took the elevator down. She walked through the lobby and out into the street. The sun was high and pale. The city was loud and full of people. She stood on the sidewalk and she did not know where to go. Her phone rang. She answered it. Ida. It was a woman's voice. Familiar. Cold, Ida said. I heard you found something, Elena said. A piece of paper in a coat. Ida said nothing. I'm calling to warn you, Elena said. That paper is worthless. The policy is lapsed. It's dead. There's nothing you can do. You let it lapse on purpose, Ida said. I let it lapse because I didn't want to pay for it, Elena said. Rupert was dead. Why should I keep paying for something that belonged to him? He should have told me about it. He should have made me the beneficiary. But he didn't. He made you. And I wasn't going to let you have it. You stole from me, Ida said. I didn't steal anything, Elena said. I just didn't pay the premiums. That's not stealing. That's letting something die. Ida closed her eyes. The sun was warm on her face. The document was in her bag. The shears were in her pocket. The woman on the phone was the mother of her grandson. The woman on the phone had stolen her future. Where is my son? Ida asked. There was a pause. Your son is fine, Elena said. He's with me. He's happy. He doesn't need you. I want to see him. You can't. Elena. Goodbye, Ida. The line went dead. Ida lowered the phone. She stood on the sidewalk. The city moved around her. The sun was high. The wind was cold. She thought of her grandson. She thought of his round face and his small hands and the way he had laughed when she had bounced him on her knee. She had not seen him in 2 years. She did not know if he remembered her. She started walking. She walked for a long time. She walked through neighborhoods she did not recognize. She walked past shops and schools and parks. She walked until her legs ached and her feet blistered and the sun began to sink behind the buildings. She ended up at the river. She stood at the railing and looked at the water. The same river she had crossed the night before. The same black current. The same indifferent flow. She took out the document. She held it in her hands. She could let it go. She could let it fall. She could walk away and never think about it again. But she thought of Rupert. She thought of the coat. She thought of the thread counter she had left behind on the bank desk, the small brass tool that had been her mother's, that had been hers, that had measured thread count for 3 generations. She put the document back in her bag. She turned away from the river. She went home. The weeks that followed were a blur of phone calls and meetings and documents. Marcus Chen filed a lawsuit against Northern Trust Life. He argued that the policy had been deliberately concealed from the beneficiary, that the owner had acted in bad faith, that the lapsed premiums were the result of intentional neglect rather than oversight. The insurance company responded with a motion to dismiss. They argued that the policy was clear. If premiums were not paid, the policy was void. They argued that the beneficiary had no standing to challenge the lapse because the owner had been responsible for payment. Marcus Chen deposed George Mavrakis. The old man sat in a chair in his shop, his hands folded on his lap, and he told the truth. He told them about the day Rupert had come in with the paper. He told them about the signature. He told them about the look on Rupert's face when he said, if anything happens to me, she will find it. He told them about Elena. She was there, George said. She signed it too. She knew what it was. She knew. Marcus Chen deposed Dennis Okonkwo. The bank manager testified that Ida had opened the safe deposit box with a key she had worn around her neck. He testified that she had not known what was inside. He testified that she had found the policy by accident, by instinct, by love. He testified about the coat. She had it with her, Dennis said. An old coat. She found the document sewn into the lining. She had to cut it out with shears. The insurance company's lawyers asked, "Did she seem surprised?" Dennis said, "She seemed like a woman who had been waiting her whole life to find something, and she had finally found it." The case went to trial. Ida sat in the courtroom every day. She wore the same dress. She sat in the same seat. She watched the lawyers argue. She watched the evidence pile up. She watched the judge take notes. She did not look at Elena. Elena was there too. She sat on the other side of the courtroom, her hair perfect, her suit expensive, her face expressionless. She did not look at Ida either. They sat in the same room, separated by a few feet and a lifetime of grief. The trial lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, the judge issued her ruling. She ruled in favor of Ida Quinn. The policy was validly issued, the judge said. The beneficiary was clearly named. The owner acted in bad faith by deliberately allowing the policy to lapse without informing the beneficiary. The insurance company is ordered to pay the full amount of the policy, plus interest, to Ida Quinn. Ida closed her eyes. She heard Marcus Chen say, "Thank you, Your Honor." She heard the rustle of papers. She heard the scraping of chairs. She heard Elena's heels clicking on the floor as she walked out of the courtroom. She opened her eyes. She did not look back. She walked out of the courthouse and into the sun. Marcus Chen was beside her. He was saying something about the money, about the timeline, about what she wanted to do next. She did not hear him. She was thinking about the coat. She went back to the apartment. She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at the coat. It was still hanging on the back of the chair by the window. She had not touched it since the night she had cut the document out of the lining. She reached out. She touched the wool. It was soft. It was worn. It was Rupert. She picked up the coat. She held it to her face. She breathed in. The smell was almost gone. She put the coat down. She looked at the hole she had cut in the lining. The shears had made a clean cut. The edges were straight. The threads were loose. She took out the shears. She had carried them with her every day since the night she had found the document. She had kept them in her pocket. She had held them when she was afraid. She set them on the table. She sat there for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. She called Marcus Chen. "I want to find my grandson," she said. Marcus Chen said, "I'll do what I can." He found him. It took 3 weeks. He hired a private investigator. He subpoenaed school records. He tracked Elena's movements through credit card statements and rental agreements. He found the address. A house. In a suburb. With a yard, with a swing set. With a bicycle in the driveway. Ida stood across the street. She watched the house. She watched the door. She watched the windows. She saw a boy. He was 7 years old. He had Rupert's hair. He had Rupert's eyes. He was playing in the yard, kicking a ball, laughing at nothing. She did not cross the street. She did not knock on the door. She stood there for an hour. Then she turned around and walked back to the bus stop. She went home. She took out the coat. She took out the shears. She took out a needle and thread. She sat down by the window. She began to sew. She sewed the lining closed. She sewed it the way her mother had taught her. Small stitches, even stitches, invisible from the outside. She sewed the hole shut. She sewed the memory back in. When she was finished, she held the coat up to the light. The cut was gone. The lining was whole. It looked as if nothing had ever happened. She hung the coat back on the chair. She sat down. She waited. A letter came. It was in a plain envelope. No return address. Postmarked from a city she did not recognize. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, controlled, familiar. "You won. I know you did. I saw it in the paper. $3 million. Congratulations. I'm not writing to apologize. I'm not sorry. I did what I thought was right. I protected what was mine. I protected my son. But I'm leaving. I'm taking him somewhere you won't find us. Not because I'm afraid of you. Because I don't want him to grow up in the shadow of this. I'm leaving the house. I'm leaving the car. I'm leaving everything. I'm starting over. Don't try to find us. You won't. Goodbye." Elena Ida read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer with the thread counter. She had gone back for it. The day after the trial, she had walked to the bank and asked Dennis Okonkwo if he had seen a small brass tool on the desk. He had not, but the cleaning crew had turned it in. It was in the lost and found. She had taken it home. She kept it in the drawer now. Next to the letter, next to the shears, she closed the drawer. She stood up. She walked to the chair by the window. She picked up the coat. She put it on. It fit. It still fit. It was warm. It smelled like Rupert. It smelled like wool and thread and the faint trace of cologne. She stood by the window and looked out at the street. The city was quiet. The sun was setting. The lights were coming on. She thought of her grandson. She thought of his face. She thought of his laugh. She did not know if she would ever see him again. She put her hand in the pocket of the coat. There was something there. She pulled it out, a small piece of paper, folded, old. She opened it. In Rupert's handwriting, Ada, if you're reading this, you found the coat. You found the document. You found everything. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I was afraid. I didn't know how. But I knew you would find it. I knew you would keep looking. You always did. I love you. I have always loved you. I will always love you. Take care of our grandson. Tell him about me. Tell him I loved him. I'll be waiting. Rupert, Ida held the paper in her hand. The coat was warm around her shoulders. The night was coming. She stood by the window and she did not move. She did not know what to do next. She did not know where to go. She did not know if she would ever find her grandson. She did not know if she would ever see Elena again. She did not know if she would ever use the money. She did not know anything. But she knew one thing. She knew that Rupert had sewn that note into the pocket of his coat. She knew that he had hidden it there for her to find. She knew that he had trusted her to find it. And she had. She folded the note carefully and put it back in the pocket. She buttoned the coat. She stood by the window. The street was dark. The city was full of lights. She was 75 years old. Her husband was dead. Her grandson was gone. She had $3 million in the bank. She had a coat that smelled like a memory. She had a small brass thread counter in a drawer. She had shears that had cut through the lining of a dead man's coat. She had nothing. She had everything. She stood by the window and she waited. The night was quiet. The wind came off the river. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if she would ever find her way home. But she was wearing his coat, and she was still standing, and that was enough.